The Manhattan skyline glittered below like scattered diamonds. As Lena Park adjusted the hemline of her dress one last time, the rooftop of the Meridian Tower buzzed with the electric energy of New York's fashion elite, champagne flutes catching, the golden hour light as models, influencers, and executives mingled beneath strings of Edison bulbs. The Atelier fashion house had spared no expense for tonight's gala celebrating their autumn collection, a collection that bore more of Lena's creative fingerprints than anyone in attendance would ever know. She smoothed her hands over the navy silk dress, a piece from last season's line that she'd carefully altered in her tiny Brooklyn apartment. The original had been to loosen the bodice, to longin the sleeves, but with careful stitching and a few strategic tucks, she'd transformed it into something that actually fit her petite frame. It wasn't the latest design, wasn't adorned with this season's signature beading or the coveted crystal embellishments that sparkled on the other guests, but it was hers in a way that mattered. Lena, the photographer, needs the mood boards moved to the west corner, called Marcus Chen, the event coordinator, his headset crackling with urgent whispers from the production team. She nodded, grateful for the task that would keep her hands busy and her mind focused on something other than the way conversations seemed to quiet when she passed. As she maneuvered through the crowd carrying the carefully curated displays of fabric swatches and inspiration images, fragments of conversation drifted around her like smoke. The usual Fashion Week gossip: who was wearing whom, which celebrities had confirmed their attendance at tomorrow's shows, speculation about the rumored new investor who'd been quietly buying shares in luxury brands across Europe. Lena had heard whispers about him in the studio too, though no one seemed to know much beyond his name, Julian Reese, a shadowy figure who preferred boardrooms to ballrooms. She paused near a cluster of junior executives from the marketing department, their voices carrying over the ambient music as they discussed tomorrow's press coverage. Sarah Whitmore, the brand's social media director, held court with her usual mix of insider knowledge and calculated cruelty. "I still can't believe they're letting her work the event," Sarah was saying, her eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on Lena. "I mean, look at that dress. It's from just seasons ago. And you can tell she tried to alter it herself. The stitching is so obvious." Lena's cheeks burned, but she kept moving, pretending she hadn't heard. She'd learned long ago that responding only made things worse, that her quiet nature was often mistaken for weakness in this world of sharp elbows and sharper tongues. "At least she's useful for the grunt work," laughed James Morrison, a junior buyer whose primary qualification seemed to be his trust fund and family connections. "Can you imagine her trying to network? Hi, I'm Lena. I organize fabric samples and make mood boards." She'd clear a room in minutes. The laughter that followed felt like ice water in her veins, but Lena continued her work, arranging the displays with the same careful attention to detail that she brought to her sketches. Each board told a story, the inspiration behind the autumn collection's rich burgundies and forest greens, the architectural influences that had shaped the structured silhouettes, the vintage photographs that had sparked the dramatic collar designs. These were her stories, translated through fabric and thread, even if her name would never appear on the credits. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the rooftop, Lena found herself gravitating toward the quieter corners of the event. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through the photos she'd taken earlier of the collection, pieces displayed throughout the space, noting how the evening light transformed the textures and colors. These images would go into her personal archive, alongside hundreds of other moments of inspiration that she collected like precious stones. The crowd was growing larger now, the fashion house's biggest clients and press contacts arriving for the main presentation. Lena recognized several faces from magazines and red carpets, their presence transforming the already glamorous event into something that felt almost mythical. She watched a famous actress pose for photos near one of the signature pieces from the collection, a midnight blue gown with hand-embroidered constellations that Lena had spent weeks perfecting in the studio. "There's our little wallflower," came a voice behind her. Lena turned to see Vivian Cross, one of the house's senior models, approaching with two other women whose faces Lena recognized from Instagram campaigns, still hiding in the corners. "I see," Some things never change. Lena managed a polite smile, her heart rate quickening. Just making sure everything's set up properly for the presentation. How noble. Vivian's tone dripped with mock sincerity. Always the worker bee, never the queen. I suppose someone has to do the unglamorous work while the rest of us shine. As they walked away, their laughter mingling with the evening breeze, Lena felt the familiar weight of invisibility settle around her shoulders like a heavy cloak. In a room full of people who lived to be seen, she had mastered the art of disappearing. But sometimes, late at night in her studio apartment, she wondered what it would feel like to step into the light. 3 months earlier, Lena had been working alone in the Atelier studio long after the building had emptied. The autumn collection was in its final stages, and she'd volunteered to stay late to perfect the intricate beadwork on several evening pieces. The security guard knew her by name now. She was often the last one to leave, sometimes not heading home until well past midnight. She'd been hunched over her worktable, carefully placing each crystal by hand when she heard footsteps in the hallway. Assuming it was building security making their rounds, she'd continued working until a shadow fell across her station. That's remarkable work, a voice had said, and she'd looked up to see a tall man in an expensive but understated suit watching her with genuine interest. He had dark hair slightly tousled from the October wind, and eyes that seemed to take in every detail of her workspace. The carefully organized color palettes, the sketches pinned to her bulletin board, the small potted plant she'd brought from home to brighten her corner of the vast studio. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize anyone else was still here," she'd said, setting down her needle. "I can finish this tomorrow if you need to lock up." "Please don't stop on my account," he'd replied, moving closer to examine her work. "I'm Julian. I was just meeting with Richard about some business matters, and I wanted to see the collection." Richard was the CEO, and Lena had felt a flutter of nervousness. Late-night visits from executives usually meant someone was in trouble. Budgets were being cut, or major changes were coming. But Julian didn't seem like he was there to deliver bad news. He seemed genuinely fascinated by the creative process. "Would you mind showing me what you're working on?" he'd asked, and something in his tone, curious rather than demanding, had put her at ease. For the next hour, she'd found herself explaining her design philosophy, showing him the inspiration boards for the autumn collection, walking him through the evolution of certain pieces from initial sketch to final product. He'd listened with an attention that felt rare in her world, asking thoughtful questions about her choices, her influences, her vision for where fashion was heading. "You have an extraordinary eye," he'd said as they'd walked through the studio together, examining completed pieces. "These aren't just clothes, they're stories, emotions translated into fabric." When he'd finally left, he'd handed her a simple business card with just his name and a phone number. "I'd love to continue this conversation sometime, if you're interested. I think you see things differently than most people in this industry." That had been the beginning of their correspondence. Letters, initially actual handwritten notes delivered by messenger to her apartment, filled with observations about design, art, travel, life. He'd written about seeing a particular shade of blue in a sunrise over the Mediterranean. That reminded him of a dress in her sketches. She'd responded with photos of architecture that inspired her silhouettes, pressed flowers that captured the colors she was dreaming of for spring. That their exchanges had grown more personal over time. He'd told her about growing up feeling like an outsider despite his family's wealth, about building his business empire as a way to create something meaningful, rather than simply accumulating power. She'd shared her struggles with confidence, her dreams of someday designing under her own name, her fear that she was too quiet, too different to ever truly succeed in fashion's loud, competitive world. "Your quietness isn't a weakness," he'd written in one letter that she kept folded in her wallet. "It's a superpower. You see what others miss because you're not busy performing. You create from a place of truth instead of trend. Never let anyone convince you to be louder. The world needs more people who listen before they speak." They'd met a few more times in the studio, always late at night, always when the building was empty. Sometimes he'd bring coffee and pastries from a French bakery in Soho, and they'd sit among the fabric bolts talking about everything except the obvious tension building between them. Other times he'd simply watch her work, occasionally offering a gentle suggestion or sharing a story about something he'd seen in his travels that might inspire her next design. She'd learned that he was 38, that he'd built his fortune through a combination of tech investments and luxury brand acquisitions, that he traveled constantly but never seemed to feel at home anywhere. He'd learned that she'd grown up in a small town in Oregon, that she'd moved to New York with nothing but a portfolio and a dream, that she sent half of her modest salary home to help her parents keep their flower shop afloat. "Why don't you ever come to the company events?" she'd asked him once, after he'd mentioned that he technically owned a significant stake in Betrayal. "I prefer to understand a business from the inside out," he'd replied. "Boardrooms and galas only show you what people want you to see. The real story happens in places like this, at times like this, with people like you who actually create the magic." Now, standing on the rooftop, surrounded by the very people he'd chosen to avoid, Lena felt the weight of their secret connection. She touched the small silver locket he'd given her, a vintage piece from an estate sale in London, that he'd said reminded him of her quiet elegance. Inside was a tiny fragment of lace from the first dress she'd shown him, the one that had started their late-night conversations. The irony wasn't lost on her that while the crowd around her gossiped about the mysterious Julian Reese, she was probably the only person at the event who actually knew the sound of his laugh, the way he gestured when he was excited about an idea, the careful way he chose his words when he was trying to express something important. She wondered if he was watching the live stream of the event from wherever his travels had taken him this week, if he could somehow sense her discomfort through the screen, if he missed their quiet conversations as much as she did. The main presentation began as the sky deepened to velvet, the Manhattan lights creating a glittering backdrop for the runway that had been constructed along the rooftop's northern edge. Lena positioned herself behind the technical booth, her usual spot for events where she could monitor everything without being in the way. From here, she had a perfect view of the models as they emerged, wearing the pieces she'd helped bring to life over countless late nights. The collection was stunning under the professional lighting, each garment telling part of the story she and the design team had crafted around the theme of urban nocturne. Rich velvets in midnight blue and deep burgundy caught the light like liquid metal, while structured jackets with architectural lapels created dramatic silhouettes against the city skyline. The beadwork she'd perfected gleamed like captured starlight, and the flowing evening gowns moved like shadows dancing in moonlight. As the show progressed, Lena found herself photographing the reactions of the audience as much as the clothes themselves, the fashion editors scribbling notes, the buyers mentally calculating orders, the influencers perfecting their poses for social media. This was the moment when months of creative labor transformed into commercial success or failure, when art met market in the most public way possible. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced Richard Blackstone, the CEO, as the final model completed her walk, "tonight, we celebrate not just a collection, but a vision. Urban Nocturne represents our commitment to storytelling through design, to creating pieces that capture the poetry of modern life." Polite applause rippled through the crowd as Richard continued his prepared remarks about the brand's growth, their expansion into new markets, their gratitude to investors and partners. Lena had heard variations of this speech at every major event, corporate language dressed up in creative metaphors. "But before we toast to our success," Richard continued, "I want to acknowledge the mysterious force behind our recent acquisitions and creative freedom. Ladies and gentlemen, our primary investor has been something of an enigma, preferring to work behind the scenes. But tonight, I'm hoping we might finally." "Richard," came a voice from the crowd, cutting through the CEO's words with quiet authority. "I think I can take it from here." The crowd turned as one toward the source of the interruption, and Lena's breath caught in her throat. Julian Reese was walking through the parted crowd, moving with the confident grace she remembered from their late-night encounters in the studio. He wore a perfectly tailored black suit that somehow managed to look both formal and effortless, his dark hair slightly windswept as if he'd just arrived from the airport. "Julian Reese," someone whispered, and the name spread through the gathering like ripples on water. Phones appeared, cameras focused, the energy of the crowd shifting from polite attention to electric curiosity. Lena felt her heart hammering against her ribs. He was supposed to be in London, or Tokyo, or wherever his business had taken him this week. Their last letter had mentioned a series of meetings that would keep him away until December. What was he doing here? Julian reached the makeshift stage and gestured for the microphone. Richard, looking simultaneously thrilled and confused, handed it over without question. The crowd fell silent except for the whisper of evening wind and the distant hum of traffic far below. "Good evening," Julian said, his voice carrying easily across the rooftop. "I apologize for the dramatic entrance. I wasn't planning to be here tonight, but sometimes plans change when something important demands your attention." He paused, scanning the crowd, and for just a moment his eyes found Lena's across the sea of upturned faces. The look he gave her was warm, reassuring, and somehow apologetic all at once. "I've spent most of my career avoiding events like this," he continued, turning back to the audience. "I prefer to understand businesses from the inside, watching how they actually function, rather than how they present themselves. It's served me well in making investment decisions." Murmurs of agreement from the business-minded attendees, phones still recording every word. But tonight isn't about business strategy or market positioning. Tonight is about acknowledging something that's been hidden for too long. His voice grew softer, more personal. "You see, the creative force behind this collection, behind much of what makes Betrayal special, isn't standing on this stage giving speeches. She's standing quietly in the background, as she always does, making sure everything runs perfectly while taking none of the credit." Lena felt the world tilt on its axis. Conversations around the crowd began to buzz with speculation, heads turning, as people tried to figure out who he was talking about. "The woman who taught me that true elegance whispers instead of shouts, who showed me that the most beautiful designs come from understanding human emotion, not following trends, who has been my inspiration, my muse, and my closest confidant, for months without anyone in this room knowing her true value." Sarah Whitmore's group near the bar had gone completely silent, their expressions shifting from confusion to dawning realization. Other faces in the crowd showed similar recognition. As they began to process Julian's words, "Lena Park," Julian said clearly, and every person on the rooftop turned to look for her. "Would you please join me?" The technical booth suddenly felt like a spotlight had found her. Lena stood frozen, her mind racing through a dozen reasons why this couldn't be happening. Why Julian would risk exposing their connection so publicly. Why he would associate his reputation with her invisible presence. "In this glittering world, Lena," he said again, his voice gentle but carrying across the suddenly silent crowd, "trust me." And somehow, despite everything, despite her terror of being the center of attention, despite knowing that every phone in the crowd was now trained on her, despite having no idea what came next, she found herself moving toward the stage. The walk across the rooftop felt like crossing an ocean. Every step brought whispers, stares, the soft clicking of camera phones capturing her emergence from the shadows. Lena's legs felt unsteady, but Julian's eyes remained fixed on hers, steady and encouraging, drawing her forward like a lighthouse beacon. When she reached the edge of the makeshift stage, he extended his hand to help her up. His fingers were warm and familiar, grounding her in the moment even as everything around them seemed to blur into surreal motion. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian said, keeping her hand in his as they faced the crowd together, "meet the woman who designed the heart of tonight's collection, who understands that fashion isn't about following trends. It's about capturing the way we want to feel when we wear our dreams." The crowd's reaction was a mixture of shock, confusion, and rapid recalculation. Lena could see Sarah Whitmore's face, pale and disbelieving. James Morrison looked like he was trying to solve a complex equation. Richard Blackstone appeared to be mentally rewriting every conversation he'd ever had with his quiet assistant designer, Lena. Julian continued, turning slightly toward her. "You've spent months telling me you don't belong in rooms like this, that you're too quiet, too different, too invisible for this world." His voice carried that same gentle intensity she remembered from their late-night conversations. "But invisibility isn't your weakness, it's your superpower. You see what others miss because you're not performing for cameras. You create from truth instead of trends." He paused, And in that silence, Lena found her voice. "I'm terrified," she whispered. But the microphone caught her words and carried them across the rooftop. Julian smiled, the same smile she'd fallen in love with over coffee and fabric samples in an empty studio. "I know, but you're not alone anymore. The beadwork on the evening gowns," he said to the crowd, "those aren't machine-applied crystals." Lena placed each one by hand, working until past midnight for weeks to get the pattern perfect. The architectural lines in the blazers, those came from her sketches of the Brooklyn Bridge at sunrise. The color palette that everyone's been calling revolutionary, she developed it from photographs of autumn leaves in Prospect Park. With each revelation, Lena watched the crowd's perception shift. The dismissive glances were becoming curious stares. The whispered mockery had transformed into avid attention. She was the same person who'd been serving as invisible wallpaper an hour ago. But now she was someone worth studying, worth knowing. "Julian," she said quietly, "why are you doing this?" "Because I love you," he replied, and though he'd said it softly, the microphone and the hushed crowd meant everyone heard. "Because you deserve recognition for your talent, and because I'm tired of hiding the most important thing in my life." The crowd erupted. Cameras flashed like strobes, voices rose in excitement, and somewhere in the chaos, Lena heard someone calling her name not dismissively, but with genuine curiosity. A fashion journalist was pushing through the crowd, eager for an interview. A buyer was demanding to know which pieces in the collection were specifically her designs. But Julian was speaking again, his voice cutting through the noise. "Lena has been offered the position of lead designer here at Atelier Neuer, effective immediately. However," he paused, squeezing her hand, "I understand she has other plans." All eyes turned to her again, and this time, Lena felt something shift inside her chest. The terror was still there, but underneath it was something she'd never experienced in public before, the feeling of being truly seen. "I'm grateful for everything Atelier Neuer has taught me," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "But I've decided to launch my own label, something smaller, more personal, fashion that tells stories instead of chasing trends. With Julian as your investor," called out a voice from the crowd. Lena looked at the man whose letters had sustained her through months of feeling invisible, whose quiet confidence had shown her that power didn't always need to announce itself. "With Julian as my partner," she corrected. In every sense, the party continued around them for another hour, but everything had changed. Suddenly Lena found herself surrounded by people who wanted to know her story, her vision, her plans. The same individuals who dismissed her earlier were now competing for her attention, eager to associate themselves with the woman who'd captured the interest of Julian Reese. But as the evening wound down and the crowd began to thin, Lena felt most grateful for the quiet moments between the conversations. When Julian would catch her eye across the rooftop and smile, when he'd place a protective hand on her back, as journalists asked increasingly personal questions, when he'd whisper encouragement during the overwhelming moments. 6 months later, Lena Park's studio opened in a converted warehouse in Brooklyn, specializing in limited edition pieces that emphasized craftsmanship over mass production. The waiting list for her designs stretched 6 months out, filled with clients who valued the story behind each piece as much as the garment itself. Fashion magazines featured her as part of a new generation of designers, prioritizing authenticity over artificial hype. Sarah Whitmore now followed Lena's Instagram account religiously, liking every post within minutes of publication. James Morrison had tried to schedule a coffee meeting 3 times, suddenly discovering an appreciation for artistic vision. Richard Blackstone sent quarterly emails checking if she might be interested in a consulting arrangement. But the most meaningful change was the simplest one. In the studio she shared with Julian, who'd discovered that being part of the creative process was more fulfilling than simply funding it from a distance. Lena worked in comfortable silence, occasionally looking up to find him watching her, with the same expression he'd worn that first night in the Atelier Neuer studio. "Any regrets about the dramatic reveal?" she asked him one evening as they worked late, the Brooklyn skyline glittering beyond their windows. Julian looked up from the business plan they were developing for their second year. Penn paused mid-sentence. "Only that I waited so long to do it. You were never invisible, Lena. You were just waiting for the right moment to let yourself be seen." She smiled, returning to her sketches for the spring collection designs inspired by the way morning light fell across their shared workspace, by the gentle chaos of creating something beautiful together, by the discovery that true recognition came not from standing in spotlights, but from being known completely by the right person. The quiet revolution had begun, one careful stitch at a time.